I'm Bill Hare, and this is the importance of the 1.5 degree warming limit. The principal goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming, and the language is legally complicated. It's to hold warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. In shorthand though, the takeaway message is that the Paris Agreement is aiming to limit global mean warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, and that's now the scientific and legal consensus. The very important advisory opinion on climate change of the International Court of Justice has reinforced the centrality of the 1.5 degree limit in the Paris Agreement as a guide to action by countries and companies and anyone else who needs to take action. There's another important provision of the Paris Agreement in relation to climate goals, and that's the net zero goal. This is in another article of the Paris Agreement, and it requires countries to work together to bring greenhouse gas emissions to net zero in the second half of the century. Net zero is a really important concept at the global level, something that many people don't really appreciate, but that was very strongly negotiated by the vulnerable countries because the small island states, for example, needed to see warming peak and drop in order to minimize the risk of really massive sea level rise. That's the only way that we can really stop or avoid or minimize the risk of multi-meter sea level rise in the next century or two is by getting warming dropping. And that's why net zero is one of the most important provisions of the Paris Agreement that complements the 1.5 degree limit temperature goal. The Paris Agreement has done a lot for the world. If you look at it in climate space, if you like, when we negotiated the Paris Agreement, countries were looking at the collective effect of their actions would have literally cooked the planet, warmed it by 3.5 to 4 degrees. Now, after a decade, that's down to below 3 degrees, 2.7 to 3 degrees, say. So that is progress. It's frustratingly slow progress, and it's not enough, but it is progress. And I think that's really important to recognize. Another really big important thing that the Paris Agreement brings to the world is it brings the world together. It's the multilateral place, the universal global place where countries, corporations, civil society, scientists can discuss and debate and work on actions. Because it's a UN agreement, a full multilateral agreement means that the smallest countries can deal with the biggest countries at the same level. It literally is the only place in the world where Tuvalu can look at China across the table at the same level and get the same level of respect. There's simply no other place in the world where that can happen. And the political dimension to that is that ultimately we see at the moments in history where things have moved forward on the climate front, it's the vulnerable countries that have embarrassed the big countries into action, one way or the other. And that can only happen right now through the Paris Agreement. There's no other place we can do that. I know there's a lot of discussion as the world has reached 1.5 degrees for a few years that limit might no longer be relevant, but there's a couple of reasons why it remains more relevant than ever. So what's for sure is it's definitely a legal, moral and political boundary encoded in the Paris Agreement, and the force of that was reinforced by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. And the physical limits implied in 1.5 degrees, or that would be approached at 1.5 degrees, these are looking increasingly serious. We've learned a lot about the limits of a lot of systems to warming, and we know that 1.5 degrees is emerging as a kind of critical threshold. 3 good examples might be the triggering of the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. We're very close to that now, close to 1.5 degrees warming. That would lead to multi-meter sea level rise, maybe within a century or two. Right? Really big disaster globally. The tripping of the Amazon rainforest, the conversion of the Amazon rainforest through warming and deforestation to a dry savanna with loss of biodiversity, loss of livelihoods, and all the services that go with it, is also likely close to or slightly above 1.5 degrees. The third issue is the coral reef issue. So for coral reefs, we know that by the time you get to 2 degrees warming, you probably have lost a lot. Let's say 99% of reefs, would be bleached and unable to recover from successive marine heat waves. 1.5 degrees, 70 to 90% loss is projected some years ago. And I would note that in the last year or so, we've had a massive global bleaching event that has caused between 70 and 90% mortality of coral reefs globally, right? In other words, the science got it right. And the question is whether or not they have tipped permanently at 1.5 degrees. I'm hoping not, but that's another boundary.